The morning they called me a criminal, I was cleaning the chemical residue off my boots. I didn't even know my name had appeared in the news until my neighbor showed me his phone. My full name was printed under a headline that read, "A local technician linked to East Palestine disaster." For a few seconds, I thought it was some mistake, maybe someone else with the same last name. But then I saw the photo. It was me, standing in front of the plant gate from an old company event. I remember that moment clearly because it felt like the world had tilted a few degrees out of balance. The smell of solvents was still on my hands, the metal bucket beside me half full of gray water, and somewhere in the background, a crow was screaming from the power line. Everything looked ordinary, but I knew life had changed in a way I couldn't fix. 3 days earlier, on a cold February night, a freight train had derailed near East Palestine. The explosion shook windows as far as the next county. People said it looked like a sunrise that arrived at midnight. Bright, violent, and wrong. The local news called it a controlled release at first, but the images told another story. Huge black plumes rolling into the sky, lighting up the wet fields below. At first, I didn't think much of it. Accidents happened. I'd seen my share of spills, leaks, and misfires in 12 years of industrial work. But this one was different. The smoke didn't fade, and the air carried a sharp taste that sat on your tongue for hours. Within a day, officials started warning residents to avoid open air. By the second day, the name of our company began to appear in the coverage. I worked as a maintenance technician at a small chemical supplier that produced stabilizers for industrial transport. We weren't a big player, just one of many subcontractors feeding into a system too large to see the ends of. My job was to check the tanks, monitor pressure systems, and log every small adjustment. The kind of work that goes unnoticed until something goes wrong. I had always been proud of doing things by the book. I didn't cut corners, not even when nobody was watching. Weeks before the accident, I'd filed a note recommending that one of our delivery valves be replaced. It wasn't an emergency, but it was showing corrosion, and I didn't want to risk a leak. My supervisor said we'd handle it during the next inspection cycle. That inspection never happened. When the train derailed, the chemical manifest listed compounds that matched what we'd shipped. A few containers were identified as belonging to our batch. That was all it took for reporters to connect the dots. Within 24 hours, they had a name, a face, and a story. A small-town worker who failed to maintain the system properly. It didn't matter that I wasn't responsible for the train's maintenance. It didn't matter that my last quality report had been spotless. The narrative was easier this way. People needed someone they could point to, someone close enough to blame, but too small to fight back. On the second morning, the company's PR department sent out a statement saying they were cooperating fully with authorities. What they didn't say was that every employee had been told to stay quiet. The plant gates were locked, and the guards turned away anyone without clearance. I sat at home, refreshing news sites, watching as the town I'd lived in my whole life became a symbol of national negligence. The smell in the air got worse. Even with the windows sealed, a faint metallic taste lingered on everything. My cat refused to eat. At night, the horizon still glowed faintly orange, even though officials said the fires were out. Helicopters flew overhead, their lights sweeping over empty streets. Sometimes I caught myself holding my breath without realizing it. By the third day, strangers began messaging me. Some were reporters asking for comment. Others were people I didn't know accusing me of killing fish, poisoning children, destroying their homes. They found my social media accounts, old photos, even my mother's address. I deleted everything I could, but screenshots spread faster than I could react. I didn't tell anyone, but part of me wondered if maybe I was at fault. I replayed my maintenance log over and over in my head. Had I missed something? Could I have insisted harder on replacing that valve? I'd done my part, followed the protocol, but in disasters like this, the truth doesn't matter. Perception does. On the fifth night, it rained. The puddles shimmered with a strange rainbow film that moved when the wind changed. I thought about leaving town, but where would I go? My entire life was built here. The job, the mortgage, the routines that made sense only in this one small place. The following week, investigators showed up at the plant. I wasn't called in. But I heard from a colleague that my name was mentioned during a briefing. The words of possible negligence were used. He told me quietly that higher management was trying to distance themselves, implying that the maintenance team had ignored a warning. That a warning was my note. The same note I'd written to prevent a failure was now being used as proof that I'd caused one's who. Quantity. That was the moment I realized how little truth mattered. Companies survive by redirecting blame. Towns survive by forgetting. Workers like me are left somewhere in the middle, crushed between the story people want and the reality that nobody cares to see. I started keeping a notebook, writing down every small detail I remembered, dates, readings, inspection times. It felt pointless, but it gave me something to hold on to. The nights grew colder. The air never cleared. Never cleared. My skin began to itch in places I couldn't see. I didn't know it yet, but that was only the beginning. The real damage wasn't in the air or water. It was in how quickly people turned away once they'd found someone to blame. The first government teams arrived a week after the derailment. They wore white suits that looked too clean for this town. I watched them from my car as they set up tents near the creek, where the fish had already started floating to the surface. The stream ran behind the warehouse where I used to check the tanks, and I recognized the bend in the water immediately. It was strange seeing it on national television later, with the words "a toxic contamination zone" across the bottom of the screen. I didn't go near the plant that week. Nobody did. The company sent out an email saying we were on paid leave until further notice, which sounded better than it was. There were no instructions, no next steps, just silence. The managers who had once checked in daily were gone, unreachable. Calls went to voicemail. Emails came back with automatic replies. It was like the place had been erased overnight. The quiet should have been a relief, but it wasn't. Each day started with the same routine. Wake up, check the news, feel my stomach twist when I saw my own face in old photos. They used the same picture again and again, cropped from a company event where I'd been holding a wrench and smiling. I looked ordinary, harmless. Maybe that's why it worked so well. A man like me was the perfect villain, invisible until needed. At first, people from town avoided me politely, the kind of avoidance that hides behind small talk and quick exits. Then it turned sharp. A man at the gas station muttered something about a reckless workers. Someone left a note on my car that said, "You should leave before we make you." I threw it away, but it stayed in my mind all day. The town itself started changing in ways that didn't fit headlines. The soil looked dry even after rain. The grass turned pale. The kids who used to ride their bikes near the tracks disappeared from the streets. Everyone walked faster, spoke softer. People said the government cleanup would make things right, but nobody believed it. The smell lingered no matter what they burned, buried, or cleaned. The night the evacuation order lifted, helicopters still circled above. They said it was safe to return, that the air had been tested. I drove toward the crash site just to see it once, needing to understand what had destroyed everything. The highway lights stopped half a mile before the area. Beyond that, it was dark except for the flood lamps from the work crews. The tracks were twisted and blackened, the ground covered in white foam that looked like snow but smelled of bleach. I stood there a long time until one of the guards told me to go back. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about how the entire disaster had been reduced to numbers on screens. Gallons spilled, homes evacuated, days since impact. But behind those numbers were the lives of people like me, small, unrecorded, already fading from attention. 2 weeks later, I got a letter from the company's legal office. It was worded carefully. You are required to provide documentation regarding your involvement in maintenance operations related to product batch 14A. I read it 3 times. That batch was the one from my final shift. It was the one with the corroded valve. I knew then they were building a wall, and I was the brick they planned to remove. I spent the next few days going through old notebooks, trying to piece together the exact timeline. I still had the inspection sheet where I'd written my recommendation. The date matched perfectly with the shipment log. It proved I had followed procedure. I thought that would protect me. It didn't occur to me yet that procedure only matters when someone higher up wants it to. A week after that letter, an investigator came to my house. He didn't accuse me of anything outright. He asked the same questions in different ways. When had I last inspected the tanks? Had I noticed signs of wear? Had I ever reported equipment issues? I told him the truth. Yes, I had, and I'd filed the report. He took notes, nodded, and left. The interview lasted less than 20 minutes. That night, I felt lighter for the first time. I thought maybe it was over. But the next morning, another article appeared online, quoting an unnamed source from the plant. Warnings about possible valve corrosion were ignored. The source didn't say who ignored them, only that a technician had failed to ensure proper maintenance. It was me, of course. The phrasing was deliberate, vague enough to avoid liability, sharp enough to point in my direction. The call started again. Some were reporters, others were just people shouting. I stopped answering the phone. I disconnected the doorbell camera because I couldn't stand the notifications anymore. The sense of being watched became constant, even when I knew nobody was there. I tried to focus on simple things, washing dishes, writing notes, cleaning the porch. But each task carried a quiet panic, as if everything I touched might also be turned against me later. My world had shrunk to the size of my house, and even there, the air didn't feel clean. One night, the rain came again, heavier this time. I opened the window a crack just to listen. The smell was sharp, almost metallic, and I could taste it on my tongue, somewhere out there. The creek was still carrying the chemicals downstream, long after the cameras had left. I thought about quitting, leaving everything, finding work somewhere far away. But the truth was, there was nowhere else to go. My name was already tied to this place in the worst possible way. I was the man they blamed for poisoning the town. As the weeks passed, people moved on. The story fell lower on the news sites, replaced by something else. But in East Palestine, nothing returned to normal. The soil stayed dry. The headaches lingered. The silence deepened. By the end of that month, I realized what they had taken from me wasn't just my job or reputation. They had taken the version of myself that believed in fairness, the part that thought telling the truth would always be enough. And somewhere in the background of that silence, I began to understand that this was only the start. The questioning took place 2 weeks later in a rented office building near the highway. The lawyers were polite at first, offering coffee and small talk, but everything about the room felt rehearsed. The neutral walls, the glass table, the sound of the recorder clicking on. They began by asking routine questions about my job title, my responsibilities, my training certifications. I answered carefully, sticking to facts. Then they started circling around the reports I'd filed before the accident. They wanted details. When I'd noticed the corroded valve, who I'd spoken to, whether I'd ever documented the leak I claimed to have seen. I told them everything, exactly as it happened. One of them nodded occasionally, but the other kept typing without looking up. I could feel the weight of every word. When they asked if I had copies of my reports, I said no. All documentation was handled through the company's internal system. They already knew that, of course. The man across from me smiled slightly, as if confirming a prediction. Without those files, my warnings existed only as my memory. And memory doesn't hold much value in legal proceedings. They thanked me at the end and told me I might be contacted again. As I stood to leave, one of them asked, almost casually, whether I still lived in East Palestine. I said yes. He looked surprised, then gave a sympathetic nod. "Must be hard to stay," he said. It wasn't a question, so I didn't answer. Outside, the sky was pale and cloudless. The smell of chemicals still lingered faintly, even miles away from the derailment site. I wondered if they noticed it too, or if I'd just grown too used to it to tell the difference anymore. That night, when I returned home, there was a letter taped to my door. No envelope, no signature. Just a folded piece of paper with a single line: "You should have kept quiet." I stood there for a long time, the paper trembling in my hand. It wasn't that I hadn't expected something like this. Rumors spread easily in small towns, and blame travels faster than reason. But seeing it written made it real. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and sat in the dark. I didn't call the police. I knew what they'd say. No witnesses, no evidence, probably a prank. But the fear stayed. I began double-checking the locks every night, closing the curtains tighter, keeping the porch light on even when I slept. It felt ridiculous, like I was overreacting. Yet the silence outside my house had a different weight now. Every creak and gust of wind carried a new edge. A few days later, I ran into one of my former co-workers at the grocery store. He looked uncomfortable when he saw me, glancing around as if someone might be watching. We exchanged a few words about the weather, about how quiet town life had become, and he said something I couldn't shake off. They're saying the leak you found wasn't even related to the derailment, he said softly, that it was a separate issue. They're building their defense around that. I wanted to argue to explain the system layout, the shared lines, the maintenance logs, but I could see it in his eyes. He didn't want to know the details. He wanted to survive the situation by pretending it was someone else's problem. I let him go, watching him disappear down the aisle, and realized how isolation grows not from distance, but from avoidance. At night, I began to write longer entries in my notebook, not about guilt, but about observation. The way the town had changed, not visibly, but in its rhythm. People spoke more softly now. Windows stayed closed. Gardens were left unattended. You could sense the fatigue in every movement, as if everyone was waiting for someone else to fix what couldn't be fixed. I walked near the railroad once more. The ground there had been dug up and refilled so many times it looked unnatural, a patchwork of disturbed soil and new gravel. A few wildflowers had started growing again, but they looked strange, too bright, as if the soil was feeding them, something it shouldn't. There were still security signs posted, though no one patrolled anymore. I stood by the tracks and imagined the night it happened. The firelight, the noise, the sudden chaos. I thought about how quickly everything transforms, from normalcy to disaster, from certainty to doubt, and how fast the world forgets once the headlines move on. Back home, I found an email waiting for me from the law firm. They thanked me again for my cooperation and informed me that my testimony might be included in a collective filing. No timeline, no guarantees. I closed the message without replying. It felt like a formality, a gesture meant to look like progress. Weeks passed like that, small signs of life returning, mixed with reminders that things were not okay. The creek remained discolored. A few pets in the neighborhood died suddenly, which people blamed on age, though deep down everyone wondered. The air monitoring reports were released monthly now, each one insisting that levels were within safety parameters. I didn't believe it anymore. Then one morning, I woke up to find dead fish floating near the surface of the creek again. Not many, just a dozen or so. But it was enough to make my chest tighten. I took photos, sent them to the county office, and received a short reply thanking me for a community engagement. Nothing changed afterward. I realized then that the catastrophe had stopped being an event. It had become a condition. Condition. Slow. A quiet corrosion that didn't just affect the soil or water, but the way people thought about truth. I kept thinking about the letter on my door. Whoever wrote it wasn't entirely wrong. Maybe I should have kept quiet. Not because I was guilty, but because truth, once spoken, doesn't belong to you anymore. It becomes ammunition for someone else's story. Still, even with the fear, even with the isolation, I couldn't regret speaking up. There was a point before all of this when I thought doing the right thing would matter, that evidence and honesty would be enough. Now I knew better. The world didn't reward integrity. It tolerated it, briefly before moving on. That night I sat by the window, the notebook open on my lap. I wrote, when silence becomes safer than truth, the poison is already spread. It felt like the only sentence that mattered. Summer came quietly that year. The air grew heavier but not warmer. Clouds hung low for days at a time, and the sunsets took on an odd hue, a reddish tint that looked beautiful at a distance but felt wrong when you stood under it. The cleanup crews were gone, yet the trucks still passed through town covered with tarps and warning signs. Every time I saw one, I felt a pulse of guilt, even though I had no reason to. People had begun leaving in small waves. Houses went up for sale, and some sold fast to investors who didn't live anywhere near here. Others stayed empty. The grocery store shortened its hours, and the hardware shop closed entirely. A few small businesses tried to adapt, advertising themselves as a rebuilding East Palestine, but the customers weren't enough. The town's heart had slowed to a weak rhythm. I tried applying for work outside the county, but every application seemed to die after the background check. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe my name had become tied too closely to the derailment. When I searched my own name online, I found comments under articles, calling me careless, a whistleblower, a liar. Some posts contradicted each other entirely, but the damage was already done. Once the internet decides what you are, there's no going back. I stopped reading the comments. I stopped checking the news. The only sound I wanted was the wind through the trees, but even that had changed. It carried something metallic now, faint but distinct, as if the leaves themselves remembered the fire. One afternoon, I drove toward the far edge of town where the soil remediation pits had been dug. The fences were still up, and the warning signs bleached from the sun. I parked and walked along the road, counting the silence between the distant bird calls. There was a thin layer of dust on the ground, white and fine like powdered stone. I didn't touch it. I just watched it move slightly under the wind, thinking about how contamination hides, how it doesn't vanish but simply becomes invisible. Later that week, I received another letter from the law firm. It wasn't about testimony this time, but about a potential class action settlement. The language was dense and careful, full of phrases like a without admission of fault and in the interest of resolution. The amount offered to affected workers was small, barely enough to cover a month's rent. I signed nothing. At night, I couldn't sleep. The hum of the refrigerator became too loud, and every shadow on the wall seemed to carry motion. I started leaving the television on, not to watch it, but to have another voice in the room. Silence had begun to feel dangerous. A few days later, I received a call from someone I hadn't heard from since before the accident. Amanda, one of the safety coordinators. Her voice was tired but steady. She said she'd been contacted by federal investigators reviewing company practices. They wanted to cross-reference internal reports, but most of the data had gone missing. She asked if I had kept anything. I told her no. Everything was in the company system. She paused and said quietly, "That's what they told us too. But it looks like someone deleted the archives after the derailment. Every safety log for the last 2 years." For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The sound of her breathing through the phone reminded me of the nights we'd stayed late at the plant, checking alarms that no one else cared about. I wanted to believe this was just incompetence, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Deletion is a D. She said she might give a statement, but she was scared. Her husband had already been warned by someone from the company that she should stay out of it. I told her I understood. We both knew how this story usually ended. Not with justice, but with exhaustion. After the call, I sat on the porch watching the sky darken. Lightning flashed somewhere beyond the horizon, though no rain came. The power flickered briefly, and I thought of that first night again. The sound, the glow, the beginning of all this. Disasters have a way of looping back on themselves, repeating their shape in smaller, quieter echoes. Days turned into weeks. My routine became mechanical. Wake up, check the mail, walk by the creek, write in the notebook. The cat had started sleeping near the window, watching the same spot where the mail truck used to stop. I envied that stillness. Then one evening, Amanda called again. Her voice was shaking. "They found something," she said. "One of the old backup drives. It has timestamps, including yours. The valve reports." I didn't speak for a few seconds. My throat felt dry. "They can prove you warned them," she continued. "It's there in writing." It should have felt like relief, but it didn't. Instead, I felt something heavier. The realization that proof changes nothing if the damage has already become a memory. People had already made up their minds. The cleanup was over. The lawsuits were being settled, and the world had moved on. Still, she said she'd send me a copy once it was verified. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the files, the ones I'd written in routine hours, never imagining they would one day matter. Small digital notes that outlasted everything else. A week later, a flash drive arrived in an unmarked envelope. No note, no sender. I plugged it into my old laptop, half expecting it to be blank. But there they were, the inspection logs, dated and time-stamped, my name on each entry. Warnings clearly marked as urgent. I stared at the screen until my eyes blurred. Proof, finally. Proof that I hadn't failed, that I had done my job. For a moment, I felt something close to peace. Then I saw the last entry. It wasn't mine. It was dated 2 days before the derailment. The username belonged to one of the managers, the same one who'd spoken at the town meeting. The report noted a pressure fluctuation in the tank system and included a short line. The issue temporarily suppressed pending inspection. Suppressed. That word repeated in my mind. Not fixed, not resolved, suppressed. I saved a copy and unplugged the drive. My hands were trembling, not from fear but from clarity. The disaster hadn't been a mistake. It had been postponed negligence, delayed truth. I didn't know what to do with it yet. I only knew I couldn't keep it hidden. But the last time I spoke out, it nearly destroyed me. That night, I wrote one more sentence in my notebook. Some truths don't set you free. They just prove you were never wrong. The next morning, I printed out a copy of the report and placed it in an envelope. I didn't write a return address. I mailed it to a journalist whose name I remembered from the early coverage. Then I walked to the creek again and watched the water move slowly, carrying reflections of a sky that no longer looked real. I didn't feel heroic. I didn't feel brave. But for the first time in months, the weight on my chest felt slightly lighter. The truth was out again, drifting, uncertain where it would land. The journalist never replied, not directly. Weeks went by in silence, and I started to assume the envelope had been discarded or buried under other stories. Maybe the files were too technical, too dull, compared to the images of flames and black smoke people had already seen. Disasters fade fast once the spectacle is over. Then one morning, a new article appeared online. It wasn't front-page news, just a regional investigative piece titled "Internal Records Suggest Safety Suppression Before East Palestine Spill." I read it twice, hardly breathing. The details were there: the maintenance logs, the suppressed valve report, even the manager's initials. My own name wasn't mentioned. There was a line about a former employee who raised concerns prior to the incident. That was all. I didn't feel vindicated. Not exactly. The article was calm, almost cautious, like I didn't want to accuse anyone too loudly. It ended with a note that the company had declined to comment, citing ongoing litigation. Still, I knew what it meant. Somewhere buried under the legal noise and denials, the truth had resurfaced. By evening, the link began spreading through local social media. Some comments were angry, some dismissive, most confused. The narrative people had built, the one where I was the careless technician, didn't fit anymore. A few messages appeared in my inbox from old coworkers, short and awkward. Saw the article. I guess you were right. I didn't think they'd hide that stuff. I didn't respond to any of them. I didn't need to. A few days later, Amanda called again. Her voice was different this time, calmer, relieved. She said the investigators had reached out to her too. They're reopening part of the case, she said. It's not much, but it's something. I could hear the sound of traffic behind her, the normal noise of life continuing somewhere else. Be careful, I told her. They don't like being cornered. I know, she said. Then after a pause, but maybe it's time they were. When I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time, listening to the refrigerator hum and the creaks in the floor. I realized I didn't want revenge or recognition. I only wanted the truth to exist somewhere outside my own memory. Something tangible, verifiable, no longer dependent on my word alone. In the weeks that followed, subtle changes began appearing around town. The local news covered the article in brief segments. The mayor made a statement about our renewed transparency. The company issued a press release promising a full commitment to cooperation. None of it sounded genuine, but it was movement. And movement after months of stagnation felt like air after a storm. I spent more time outside, though the air still held that faint chemical tang, especially at dusk. The fields around the tracks were slowly greening again. Grass grew where soil had been overturned, but the color was uneven. Some patches too bright, others too pale. Nature was trying, even if imperfectly. One afternoon, I met an old neighbor, Carl, while walking near the creek. He hadn't spoken to me since the accusations. For a moment, I expected him to cross the street, but instead he stopped. His eyes were tired. "Read about that report," he said quietly. "I guess they did you wrong." I shrugged. "It's complicated," he nodded. "It always is. Still glad it came out." He looked at the creek and added, "The town's different now. Feels smaller." "It is," I said. We stood there for a while, saying nothing. The silence wasn't hostile anymore, just empty. Like two people standing in the ruins of something they both once trusted. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Not deeply, but peacefully enough to stop grinding my teeth. When I woke up, sunlight filled the kitchen, and for a moment, I almost forgot the constant heaviness that had lived inside me since that night. But peace is fragile here. Later that day, I received another anonymous letter. This one wasn't a threat, more of a warning. They're coming after her next. I didn't need to ask who it meant. Amanda had said she'd be giving a formal statement soon. I tried calling her, but the line went to voicemail. I left a message asking if she was safe, if she needed anything. No response came. 2 days later, the local news mentioned that an unnamed safety coordinator had been placed on administrative leave pending internal review. The timing wasn't a coincidence. That evening, I felt the old fear returning. It was quieter now, but sharper. The kind that seeps into the walls. The kind that doesn't need shouting to make itself known. I started checking the locks again. I stopped opening the curtains after dark. The world outside had proven itself unpredictable. Still, I didn't regret what had happened. The truth had cost too much to abandon. The next week, I received an envelope from an address I didn't recognize. Inside was a single printed photo, a shot of the derailment site, taken recently. The ground looked cleared, the tracks replaced, the grass starting to grow again. On the back, a short note in handwriting I recognized. Thank you. Don't stop believing it mattered. It felt like a small anchor, something to hold on to. As summer deepened, the nights became humid and restless. Power outages still happen occasionally. Nothing major. Just flickers that reminded everyone how fragile the grid had become. I'd light a candle and sit by the window watching the shadows move. The sound of distant trains still echoed through the valley. Every time I heard one, I thought about how much trust it takes to let something that powerful pass through your town. I wondered how long it would take before East Palestine stopped being a name, people associated with disaster. Maybe years, maybe never. Toward the end of July, a small community notice appeared online, a request for volunteers to help replant trees near the affected area. I didn't hesitate. I signed up, even though I knew most people there would recognize me. When I arrived that morning, the air was thick with heat. A dozen volunteers stood in a field, wearing gloves and hats, holding small saplings. No one said much, but there was no hostility either, just quiet work. I dug holes, pressed roots into soil, watered them carefully. The ground was rough and unsteady, but the saplings stood upright, trembling in the wind. It felt symbolic, maybe too symbolic, but still, it mattered. Renewal wasn't about grand gestures. It was about showing up after everything else had burned down. When we finished, someone handed out lemonade. We sat in a circle, sweating and tired. A woman I didn't know asked where I lived, and when I told her, she said, "Oh, near the creek. That place got hit bad." Still does some days. She nodded, not out of pity but understanding. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was part of something again. Small, imperfect, but human. That night, back home, I wrote one line in my notebook. The world doesn't heal by forgetting. It heals by continuing. And for once, I believed it. August arrived heavy and slow, the kind of month that feels endless. The air had grown thick again, carrying that faint scent of rust and smoke that never fully disappeared. Some days it was weaker, some days stronger, but it was always there. A reminder, quiet and stubborn. I kept helping with the replanting project on weekends. The work was repetitive but grounding. It was strange how touching the soil, the same soil I'd once avoided, made me feel connected again. The organizers were mostly volunteers from nearby counties, people who hadn't lived through the night of the derailment but came because they believed recovery was something collective. They didn't ask about my past, and I didn't offer it. By the third week, the trees were taking hold. Small green shoots reached upward from the raw earth, fragile but alive. Standing among them, I realized how easy it is to underestimate quiet resilience. Growth happens invisibly, without sound or applause. It just keeps pushing upward until it becomes part of the landscape. At home, things were calmer. The online noise had faded. The article that once stirred so much debate was buried under newer stories. Different disasters, different failures. The world had moved on again. But for the first time, that didn't bother me. Maybe forgetting, in small doses, was how people survived. Amanda called one evening. She sounded tired but lighter. She said she had been officially reinstated at work after the investigation cleared her of wrongdoing. "They still treat me differently," she said, "but it's better than silence." We spoke for a long time about the cleanup, about the new safety measures being discussed, about how strange it felt to still be part of something that had once broken you. Before hanging up, she said, "You know, I think it mattered. What we did." "I hope so," I said. After the call, I stood on the porch watching the stars. The night was still, and for once the air didn't sting my throat. I thought about everything that had happened. The fear, the anger, the endless uncertainty, and realized that survival wasn't a single moment. It was an accumulation of small decisions not to give up. But recovery wasn't linear. A few days later, the creek overflowed after heavy rain, spreading thin layers of sediment over the banks. The water looked wrong again, cloudy, unnatural. I took photos, sent them to the same county email address, and received the same automated response. I didn't expect anything different, but it still hurt to see the signs return. It was strange. How even proof of harm could start to feel familiar, almost comforting. You get used to the idea that things will always be slightly broken. One afternoon, while cleaning the shed, I found an old company uniform buried in a box. Faded, stiff with age, still carrying the faint smell of chemical storage. I sat down on the floor and stared at the patch with my name on it. For years, that name had meant competence, reliability, pride. Now it felt like a reminder of how fragile identities can be. I didn't throw it away. I folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. It wasn't about nostalgia. It was acknowledgement, a quiet acceptance that the past didn't have to disappear to stop hurting. A few weeks later, the journalist who'd written the article reached out through email. His message was short, following up on the internal documents you sent. The story's being expanded into a full investigation, but appreciate a statement if you're willing. I read it twice and closed the laptop. I didn't reply that night. I sat on the couch staring at the shadows moving across the wall. Giving a statement would mean opening everything again. The scrutiny, the questions, the threats. But part of me knew that silence too had its cost. It took me 2 days to decide. When I finally answered, I kept it brief. You can use what you have. No statement necessary. Just make sure it's accurate. He replied within the hour. It will be. After that, I didn't hear from him again. A month passed. Then one morning in September, the full story came out. This time it was national. Major outlets picked it. The suppressed reports, the deleted archives, the corporate pressure to conceal malfunctions, everything. My name appeared again, but not as an accusation. The tone was different now. Measured, respectful. The piece didn't glorify me, which I appreciate. It just told the truth, the way it should have been told from the start. When I finished reading, I sat in silence for a long time. The kind that comes after a long-held breath. That day, neighbors who hadn't spoken to me in over a year waved when I walked by. Small gestures, uncertain, but real. Toil. The tension in the town had thinned, replaced by something else. Not trust exactly, but recognition. People understood now that what happened wasn't just an accident. It was a chain of choices. Later, Amanda called again, her voice shaking with emotion. They're finally facing charges, she said. Not all of them, but some. I didn't know what to say. Words felt too small for something so heavy. I just listened. When the call ended, I went for a walk by the creek. The air was cool, and the water had cleared again after the recent rains. For the first time in nearly 2 years, I saw dragonflies hovering above the surface. Life returning, quietly. I sat down on the bank, watching the current move. My reflection wavered in the water, fractured by ripples. It looked like someone I used to know. Older, thinner, but still here. For the first time, I allowed myself to think about the future. Maybe leaving, maybe starting somewhere new. Not to escape, but to begin again without the constant echo of sirens in my memory. That night, I wrote in my notebook, the truth doesn't heal the wound. It just lets light reach the place where healing might begin. I closed the book gently and turned off the light. Winter returned quietly that year. The first snow fell early, covering the blackened soil and construction debris in a thin, forgiving layer of white. From my kitchen window, the landscape looked clean again, as if nothing had ever burned, leaked, or poisoned. But I knew better. Beneath that smooth surface, the ground still carried memory. By then, the investigation had become national news. The hearings were broadcast on local stations. For weeks, I watched officials testify, their polished language full of technical phrases that disguised responsibility. It was frustrating, but not surprising. The truth never comes out neatly. The journalist who'd published the expanded report kept his promise. He didn't sensationalize. His final piece ended with one line that stayed with me. A disaster doesn't begin with an explosion. It begins with silence. I read that sentence over and over. It summed up everything I'd learned since that night. The public reaction was complicated. Some people were angry again, demanding to know why no one had spoken sooner. Others started sending messages of support, quiet thank yous, stories from people in other towns who'd lived through similar cover-ups. It was strange to be both blamed and thanked for the same truth. I tried to focus on small routine. Work had resumed in limited form. Our department had been partially restructured under new oversight. My role shifted toward maintenance inspections, less responsibility, less stress, but steadier ground. The air inside the facility smelled of disinfectant and cold metal, but it was cleaner than it used to be. I kept my head down and did what needed to be done. At home, I began to rebuild the parts of life that had fallen apart quietly. I painted the walls, replaced the dead plants on the windowsill, fixed the loose door hinge that had creaked for months. Little things, but they felt like progress. When you've lost control of everything, there's comfort in mending something small. Amanda visited in late January. It had been nearly a year since we'd seen each other in person. She brought coffee and a folder full of documents, progress reports from the new safety committee. She looked stronger, calmer. Her hair was shorter now, and she laughed more easily. We sat by the window, watching snow drift past the glass. For a long time, we didn't talk about the past at all. Eventually, she said, "Do you ever think about leaving?" I nodded. "Sometimes, but it feels wrong to go before it's over." "Maybe it's never really over," she said. Or maybe that's the point. We talked until dusk. When she left, she hugged me briefly, the kind of gesture that carries both apology and gratitude. Watching her car disappear into the snow, I realized how rare it was for two people who'd lived through the same wreckage to still be standing, still trying. That night, the power flickered out for a few hours. I lit candles and sat in the dark, listening to the faint hum of wind through the walls. The silence felt different now, not heavy, just quiet. I thought about the word resilience, how it doesn't mean strength, not really. It means bending without breaking, reshaping yourself around loss. In February, the community center reopened. They hosted a remembrance event for the second anniversary of the derailment. I almost didn't go, but curiosity pulled me there. The hall was small, filled with familiar faces, tired but present. On one wall, they'd hung photographs. The damaged tracks, the cleanup crews, the creek at its worst. Next to them were new photos, green shoots, rebuilt homes, volunteers planting trees. The contrast was jarring and beautiful. It was proof that time doesn't erase, it layers. A local teacher read letters written by her students, kids who had been too young to understand what happened but grew up breathing its consequences. One letter said, "My mom says the ground remembers. I think it remembers that people cared." That line broke something in me. I felt tears rise without warning. It wasn't sadness exactly, more like release. For the first time, I didn't feel like an outcast or a reminder of guilt. I felt part of the place again. After the event, I walked home through the quiet streets. The snow was falling heavier now, coating everything in white. Each step made a soft sound, muffled and slow. When I reached my porch, I looked back at the trail of footprints behind me, temporary, fragile, already fading. Inside, I made tea and sat down at the table with my notebook. The pages were full now, fragments of thoughts, half-finished entries, memories I couldn't let go of. I flipped to the last page and wrote, "We mistake survival for victory, but survival is just permission to keep trying." Then I closed the book and placed it on the shelf. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the curtains. The storm had cleared, leaving everything bright and sharp. For the first time in years, I didn't smell chemicals when I opened the window. Just cold, clean air. Maybe it was temporary, maybe it wasn't. But I breathed it in deeply anyway, letting it fill the spaces that had long been hollow. That day, I walked to the creek again. The water was mostly clear. Ice fringed the banks, glinting like glass in the sun. I stood there for a long time, not thinking, just existing. A small figure in a place that had nearly destroyed me, but hadn't. Something in me shifted then. Not forgiveness, not even peace. Just a quiet readiness to move forward, whatever that meant. I turned around and started walking home. Spring came early that year. The snow melted fast, and for the first time since the derailment, the ground didn't reek when the thaw began. The air smelled like rain and soil, ordinary, almost comforting. It had been 2 years since the explosion, but time had reshaped everything. The scars were still visible, scorched trees, patches of ground that refused to grow grass. Yet the place no longer felt cursed. It felt tired, but alive. I started jogging again. The first few runs were short. My lungs still caught at the cold air. But I kept going, tracing routes through streets I once avoided. The burned-out factory had been demolished months ago. Now, just an empty lot remained, fenced off and quiet. Every time I passed it, I slowed down, not to mourn it, but to acknowledge it. The absence itself had weight. Amanda texted me occasionally. She transferred to a new district and was teaching environmental science now. Her messages were short, practical, updates about her students, her projects. Once, she sent a photo of a sapling growing in a jar on her windowsill. The caption said, "Still testing the soil, still hoping." I think that. It felt like something we both understood without needing to explain. In April, the journalist reached out again, this time to let me know the federal report had been finalized. "It's official," he wrote. "A negligence confirmed. 3 executives indicted." He didn't sound triumphant, just tired. The truth. Even when it wins, always arrives late and worn out. The town reacted quietly. There were no celebrations, no public statements. People had learned that justice doesn't feel like victory. It feels like exhaustion with a thin edge of relief. At work, things changed again. The new management implemented stricter oversight, random inspections, mandatory safety drills. It was progress, though most of us knew it came too late for what had already been lost. Still, we showed up. We did the work. That's what people do after disaster, not because they believe everything's fixed, but because stopping would mean letting the past define everything. Some nights, I'd still wake up to faint echoes of sirens that weren't really there. My body remembered before my mind did. The fear wasn't gone, it had just grown quieter. I learned to let it exist without fighting it. By summer, the town began planning a new memorial park on the edge of the affected zone. The idea came from local families who'd stayed when everyone else left. They wanted something green, something that reminded them that what happened was part of their story, but not all of it. I joined one of the volunteer crews again. The work was simple: clearing debris, leveling ground, planting young trees. Every time I dug into the soil, I found traces of the past. Melted glass, fragments of metal, blackened stones. We collected them in boxes, unsure what to do with them. One of the organizers said maybe they should stay, buried again, part of the foundation. I agreed. On the last day of planting, I stayed behind after everyone left. The air was warm, heavy with humidity and the smell of grass. I sat on the edge of the empty lot, now lined with saplings that swayed slightly in the breeze. For a while, I just listened, to birds, to distant traffic, to the quiet hum of a town still trying to find its rhythm. A small boy rode by on his bike and stopped to watch me. He pointed to the trees and asked if I worked there. I nodded. He said, "It's prettier now." Then he rode off. That simple sentence stayed with me the rest of the evening. It's prettier now. Maybe that was all that mattered. Not perfection, just progress visible to someone too young to remember how bad it had been. That night, I went home and packed a few boxes. Not because I was running away, but because I finally felt ready to leave. The company had offered relocation positions in a nearby city. For months, I'd ignored the emails, unsure whether moving would feel like betrayal. But now, I saw it differently. Sometimes healing means letting go of the ground you fought to save. The next morning, I walked to the creek one last time. The water was low and calm, gliding through smooth stones. A few cattails had returned to the banks. The air was cool and clear. I crouched down and dipped my fingers into the stream. It was cold, but it didn't burn like it once had. I stayed there for a long while, thinking about everything this place had taken and given. The exhaustion, the guilt, the brief moments of grace. The creek had carried away so much. Chemicals, ash, secrets, but it had kept flowing. That persistence felt like something worth remembering. When I finally stood, I looked back at the town. Smokestacks were gone, replaced by open sky. Houses still sagged in places, paint still peeled, but life had returned in quiet ways. Porch lights at dusk, laundry lines swaying in the wind, children's voices in the distance. The world never ends all at once. It just changes shape until one day it looks like something else. I walked home slowly, memorizing every detail I could. The cracked sidewalks, the faded street signs, the faint echo of train wheels from far away. Not to hold on to them, but to know that I'd survived them. When I reached the porch, I paused and looked at the door. The same door I'd walked through 1,000 times, both as a man certain of his place and later as someone uncertain of everything. I smiled faintly and stepped inside. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, I wrote one final entry in my notebook. Leaving isn't forgetting. It's carrying what matters in a way that doesn't destroy you. I closed the cover and left it on the table. Then I turned off the lights, sat down in the quiet and listened to the hum of the town outside. Heartbeat of something still alive, still healing, still moving forward. The day I left East Palestine was clear and windless. The air was sharp, bright, almost unnaturally still. I woke before sunrise and stood by the window for a long time, watching the light slide slowly over the rooftops. The horizon glowed faint orange, and for a brief second the town looked untouched, as if the years between the derailment and that morning had never existed. My car was already packed. Boxes filled the back seat, some with clothes, some with old papers, a few with things I hadn't used in years but couldn't throw away. The notebook sat on the passenger seat. I wasn't sure why I'd brought it. Maybe it just felt wrong to leave it behind. Before leaving, I walked through the house one last time. The floors creaked the same way they always had. The faint smell of dust and wood hung in the air. It was a small house, plain, unremarkable, but it had been the only constant when everything else fell apart. I touched the kitchen counter, the door frame, the chipped edge of the windowsill. Each detail felt like a quiet farewell. Outside, the street was empty. The trees we'd planted 2 years earlier had grown enough to cast thin shadows on the road. Their leaves trembled in the soft morning breeze. I thought about how they'd looked when they were just thin sticks in the soil, fragile, uncertain, barely alive. Now they were proof that time, when given space, knows how to repair what's been broken. I started the engine and sat there for a moment, not moving. The silence of the town wrapped around me. A train horn echoed in the distance, faint, stretched by the air. For the first time, it didn't make my stomach tighten. It was just sound, just a train, going somewhere else. Driving out, I passed the empty lot where the factory had stood. Thud. The ground was flat and clean now, surrounded by a new chain-link fence. A sign out front read, "Future Site of Community Park." I smiled when I saw it. Someone had already begun painting over the fence with green and blue swirls, imperfect but full of intent. Further down the road, I stopped by the creek one last time. The water glistened under the early sun. I crouched near the bank, touched the surface, and watched ripples spread outward. For a long while, I just listened. To the soft rush of current, to birds calling in the distance, to the steady rhythm of something still alive. I thought about everything that had happened. The explosion, the lies, the fear, the endless exhaustion that followed. I thought about Amanda, about the people who stayed, about those who left long before I found the courage to do the same. Every face, every moment was tied to this place. It struck me then that we don't leave disasters behind. We carry them differently. They become quiet companions. Reminders of fragility, of resilience, of what it costs to keep telling the truth when silence would be easier. I took a deep breath and stood. The air was cool but not toxic. The faint scent of grass and water filled my lungs. It felt like the first real breath I'd taken in years. When I reached the highway, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The town would go on, rebuilding, reshaping, remembering in its own uneven way. Maybe someday no one would mention the derailment anymore. Maybe new families would move in and see only the green of the park, the flow of the creek, the quiet houses with white fences. That would be enough. A few hours into the drive, the radio played a local segment about the ongoing recovery efforts in East Palestine. The reporter mentioned new monitoring systems, new regulations, new safety standards. Her tone was calm, optimistic. I turned down the volume and let the silence take over again. Somewhere between one exit and the next, I realized I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost anymore. I was thinking about what had survived, the people, the truth, the small stubborn hope that kept pushing through the cracks. I drove until the sun dipped low, turning the world golden. The light caught the edges of passing fields, the glint of rivers, the silhouettes of birds crossing the sky. Everything looked temporary and infinite at the same time. When I stopped for gas, I stepped out and stretched. The air smelled different here, dry, metallic, unfamiliar, but it was clean. I stood there for a while, watching cars come and go, each carrying someone else's story. I didn't know where I was heading exactly, just a way forward. That night, I checked into a small roadside motel. The room was quiet and bare. A bed, a table, a single lamp. I placed my notebook beside the lamp and opened it to the last page. For a moment, I thought about writing more, but there was nothing left to say. Everything that mattered was already there. Instead, I closed it gently and whispered the words that had been sitting in my chest for months. It's over. Not erased, but over. Then I turned off the light and let the darkness settle around me. Soft, ordinary, safe. For the first time in years, I slept through the night without waking.